And welcome back. We have the second session of the second day of the Kalecki conference. It is a presentation by Malcolm Sawyer, and the session is chaired by Alexander Gevorkian, who is the Henry George Chair in Economics and an Associate Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics and Finance at the Peter J. Tobin College of Business at St. John's University in New York City. He is a Senior Research Fellow at the Vincentian Center for Church and Society, a Research Fellow at the Center for Global Business Stewardship, and a board member at the Henry George School of Social Science and at the Armenian Economic Association. He serves as economic subject matter expert for the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations. Dr. Gevorkian is the author of a recently published book, and very well received, I might add, Transition Economies, Transformation, Development, and Society in Eastern Europe and the Former Soviet Union at Routledge in 2018. My friend Alec, the floor is yours, as they say.
Thank you, Louis-Philippe, but I just need a second after this introduction. So I'm glad to be part of this conference. I'm grateful for the invitation to chair the session. And our guest today is Dr. Malcolm Sawyer, Emeritus Professor of Economics, University of Leeds, UK. He was the lead coordinator for the EU-funded €8 million, 15-partner, 5-year project on financialization, economy, society, and sustainable development. And he was managing editor of International Review of Applied Economics for over 30 years and served on a range of editorial boards. He's the editor of the book series, New Directions in Modern Economics with Edward Elgar, and co-edits with Philippe Arestis, the annual international papers in political economy. Dr. Sawyer is the author of 12 books, including The Economics of Mikhail Kalecki with Macmillan, most recently, Can the Euro Survive? And currently working on The Power of Finance, Financialization in the Real Economy, to be published by Agenda. He has edited or co-edited over 30 books. He has published over 135 papers in referee journals and contributed over 160 book chapters on a wide range of topics, including on financialization, the Eurozone, fiscal policies, and alternatives to austerity, money, public-private partnerships, and on Kalecki and Kaleckian economics. I ask, before I yield the floor to our speaker, that we maintain the mute regime. And if you have any questions, feel free to type in the chat room. I'll try to be very careful to monitor that and raise your hand. Dr. Sawyer, would you, first of all, hello, Malcolm. Would you like me to share the screen, or will you share your?
Hopefully,
you got it. Okay.
That should be up, I hope.
Coming up, here it is. Yep. Okay, so I'm muting myself.
Okay, just trying to get it to go to full screen if I can. Yeah, okay, thanks very much. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak and all for all the organisation that's gone behind it. I think many of us who are presenting here little thought that when we started working on Kalecki, what, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that it would be such a revival of interest in his work. And I think from the presentation that we've just had from Robert to show how vibrant that the work now is. I'm wanting to focus on some of the writings of Kalecki on fiscal policy, budget deficits, particularly his writings really especially in the 1930s, when he was commenting on economic events in a variety of countries and looking at responses to the Great Depression of the time. And then a number of writings that he had written during the Second World War while he was at the Oxford Institute. And these are perhaps his more famous writings, including the famous Political Quarterly article on barriers to political obstacles to full employment, but on I think many other aspects of the budgetary policy. I think in making this presentation, I've got two, I don't know whether problems or but two issues I face. I mean, one is to try and find something new to say to this audience that on Kalecki, because in terms of his writings on budget deficits, I'm not sure I will have succeeded on that, but I hope to relate some of his writings to present issues. The second is to try to avoid the temptation of saying it's all in Kalecki, or trying to find out sentences here and there which he wrote, which I can now reinterpret and say how much foresight there is. And I'm not sure that I fully avoided that latter temptation in what I'm going to be doing. Okay, I'm going to run through really four main topics of Kalecki's writings. These clearly by no means all of the things he wrote on fiscal policy and the relation to unemployment and austerity and so forth, but I want to pick out these four, not necessarily the most important, but to show how they relate to some of the current debates and so forth. So I firstly want to make some remarks on what I call the financing and funding of public expenditure and then of private expenditure. Then the need that I think Kalecki on the whole saw, particularly his writings during the Second World War, on the need for there to be budget deficits to underpin any achievement of full employment, though of course we know the obstacles he pointed to that actually taking place, but to use that line of argument to relate that to some of the relatively recent proposals, and I suspect proposals going forward after the pandemic ends, on balanced structural budgets, but also what, as I think are likely to come out, this is the way it looks in the UK, that to be setting precise numerical targets for the budget position, quite likely to be budget surplus, in order to reduce the outstanding debt. And so I just want to go through the arguments as to why setting those sort of targets is inadvisable. Then the third aspect will be the burden or non-burden of public debt and the fiscal burden of interest payments. And then fourthly, I want to make just some remarks on political and social obstacles to full employment and how some other aspects do relate to recent debates. Okay, in talking about the firstly public expenditure, and I'll come on to make a few remarks about private expenditure, particularly investment, in a moment. But I think it is, at least I find it very useful to make the distinction which the circuitists make between initial financing and final financing. And though I think the terminology which Perry Merling now uses between the distinction between payment and funding, money used as payment, and then possibly the use of money as funding. And what I think comes out in much of the debates, particularly over modern monetary theory, is a confusion between whether it is intended that money is there to initially finance expenditure, or whether it's intended as a longer term funding, or the issue of money is intended as a longer term funding of the deficit. Now, what I just want to point to is that in a number of writings in the first half of the 1930s, when he was discussing the policies, particularly in Germany, United States, I think in Japan, to address the recession, and he talked about the roles of government expenditure, particularly infrastructure investment. But he also, I think, there spoke about the government expenditure would have to be initially, what I would call initially financed by what he, I think, often called central bank credits. So what I take from that is well, I've got this quote here, that fiscal expansion could come from the government obtaining large credits from the central bank and spending them on massive public works of one sort or another. And this would no doubt increase employment. So I think, although he didn't make, I don't think Ray made a great deal of this, I think the idea is that, perhaps the obvious idea, that public expenditure has to be initially financed in some way, and that comes from some role of the central bank was there from the present. What I would just as an aside, I think, remark there, though, in terms of the effects of that expenditure, he often pointed to the effects of the additional public expenditure on profits, so which is not surprising, I suppose, but that came out very much later in his later work, the roles of investment and government expenditure and so forth in stimulating profits. And he also, although I haven't noted it here, often referred to the issues of balance of payments problems, which he often highlighted in a way which I think often gets omitted from much of the discussion of Kalecki, although not entirely, as we saw from Robert's presentation. Okay, I've got this rather long quote, which is what Kalecki wrote in 1944 when he was at the Oxford Institute, which is just goes through the sort of just giving a kind of thought experiment, which I think illustrates this notion of the central bank and the financing of a public expenditure. So he sort of says, well, it's almost the equivalent of spending government securities, and that government securities will then actually circulate, as he puts it there, and then we turn back into, as he called it, cash at the end. So what I would argue from that is that the view that government expenditure has to be financed, and that money is always, it's where money can potentially always be available to finance government expenditure, which has obviously gone very much along with the MMT people, was there really from the beginning in Kalecki, although it has rather fallen out of view in the later one. Now, the other aspect, which I just want to briefly refer to, and they'll relate it back to some of the discussion on the earlier paper, was the financing of private expenditure. And the view I take, again, rather in a way similar to that with the public expenditure, is that Kalecki was well aware that investment or other expenditure had to be financed, but assumed or treated it that in the case of private expenditure, that the banks would provide the relevant credit for that. So I think if we go back to the neo-Kaleckian models, and the question which I think Louis-Philippe raised in terms of the relationship with Basil Moore, in effect, those neo-Kaleckian models are assuming that for the bank credit is effectively horizontal, or the supply of loans is horizontal. However, I think that Kalecki could be interpreted, although we're tucked away, I think, in a footnote, that the banks could potentially raise the rate of interest or refuse to provide the relevant credit, so that the investment would not take place, because it would be choked off, as it were, because the banks would not be providing the credit. So I think the point I'd want to make here is also that the old complaint which was made against the ISLM type of approach was that there was no allowance for the way in which, say, an expansion investment would be financed, was not ever present in Kalecki, although, again, not a great deal of fuss was made about it. I'd also just point to an article which was in the Cambridge Journal of Economics in 1991, where Missouri did make this comparison between Kalecki and the circuitist approach, and arguing that in effect in his presentations, Kalecki didn't differentiate sufficiently between the different forms of financing in terms of investment or production. Now, one of the I think features which came out from the austerity programs and so forth of the 2010s was the view that budget should be balanced, and particularly that structural budget should be balanced. And I think we know in terms of the European Union that they moved from a view that the budget should be balanced over the cycle to one which was that there should be a balanced structural budget. In one sense, I suppose they're not that dissimilar, but there was this adoption of the view of a balanced structural budget. In other cases, and I use particularly the UK example, there was a mixture of arguing that the government should run a budget surplus, and this is a quote from at the top of the screen there, a quote from George in the UK, and just after the election of 2015, then he was putting forward this idea of a strong, as he called it, new fiscal framework to entrench this permanent commitment to a budget surplus, and also so that it would then, he says, bear down on debt. What I think he didn't realise was that if this actually came about, that the surplus would eventually, of course, pay off all of the debt. And I think I calculated at the time, if the programme came into being, in about 25 years' time, all the debt would have been repaid, and then he would have had to start nationalising companies as part of from running a surplus. Now, I think you no doubt all be aware of the notion of a structural budget. The structural budget position calculated at that which would appertain if the economy were operating at potential output, and government expenditure and tax rates were maintained at their current levels. And we think that the potential output as the level of output at which inflation will be expected to be constant, and in some versions may correspond to the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Now, you may well be aware of what might be called the technical objections to the construction and use of a structural budget, which include issues of how do you estimate the potential output? Can you find a level of output at which inflation would be constant? The degree to which the estimates of potential output have path-dependent effects on output. But I think one of the things to notice, and this is the kind of shift in the in debates, is that this focus on potential output, and potential output as being the kind of constraint, and that we work a budget position around about that potential output, is in effect an abandonment of any notion of full employment. There's no reason to think that potential output will correspond to full employment. We may not even think that it will correspond to holding inflation constant. But even if it did, then there's no reason to think that potential output would correspond to full employment, in the sense of would there be sufficient capacity to, as it were, turn potential output into full employment. So I think we would also have to point out that Kalecki, I think, would have viewed the achievement of full employment as requiring not only the appropriate level of aggregate demand supported by fiscal policy and perhaps other measures, but also the creation of sufficient productive capacity. I think in various places one can read him as indicating that the economy runs subject to, or does run subject to excess capacity. But I think one can find elements with saying that it's not necessarily the case that there will be sufficient productive capacity for full employment, although we often view that in terms of what might be then called developing economies, but I don't see any reason why that can't really also be applied to industrialized economies. I think there's much to be said that, for example, at the present time in the UK, well, not present time, maybe going back six or 9 months, that even if the economy were operating close to potential output, which some would have argued it was, that was far from a position of full employment when you take into account people working part-time with less hours than they would like to, underemployment of various forms, discouraged work effects, and so forth. So in papers in 1943, 1944, Kalecki argued for a permanent budget deficit in the face of intentions to save exceeding intentions to invest. He criticized those who accepted that while budget deficits would rise during economic downswings, but who did not accept the arguments for the need for permanent budget deficits. A particular paper where he was discussing a paper on full employment, which a white paper which the British government had authorised, where it clearly indicated that whilst the budget deficit should fluctuate over, budget position should fluctuate over the business cycle, it should be around about a level which was where the budget was in balance. And he argued that that would not achieve full employment, and that one would need to run permanent budget deficit, permanent budget deficits. So the scale of those budget deficits would fluctuate over time, but there would a long run average budget deficit. So he argued that there will emerge out of a consistent anti-cyclical policy a more or less stable level of private investment, which by itself may fall short of the level required to fill the gap of savings out of full employment income. Now, I think one can apply that argument that in the context where the intention to save may well exceed the intention to invest, and in particular that to achieve full employment would require a budget deficit, to the situation of a balanced budget. And I think the same argument applies. That if you look at the equilibrium requirement of government or budget deficit equal to net savings, then clearly the requirement for a balanced structural budget is required that savings and investment intentions will be balanced at potential output. And as I say there, Kalecki's answer would surely have been that those intentions would not be balanced. I think one other remark I would make here is that I think Kalecki, at least I would interpret Kalecki as disagreeing with those who often quote from Keynes that look after unemployment and the budget will look after itself. Because whilst from a Kaleckian point of view, a revival of private demand, whether autonomous or through policy surplus, would lower unemployment and may well, if it's from private, lower the budget deficit, there's no reason to think that reaching full employment from that route would achieve a balanced budget. So that, and also the other way around, we would need to use budget deficits in order to try to underpin full employment. Now, I think we'll all be well aware of the arguments that are put forward about the burden of debt, the burden on future generations. And I got a quote here from the UK Treasury, so where the Treasury view still applies. And I think it's quite likely that these arguments will again come to the fore in the after the pandemic. We will be told that the public debt is far too high, it has to be reduced, and there will be a combination of arguments that this is a burden on future generations, and our poor grandchildren will suffer from the pandemic, and also no doubt arguments about the that debt will cause all sorts of economic problems. Well, Kalecki clearly dismissed that argument, and I think it's an argument that it will be well known to us. Interestingly, while I was looking for this, I found there was also a remark from Pigou back in 1918, making the same point, and it's quite amazing how the argument that the national debt is a burden on future generations has survived for well over 100 years, if maybe longer. I think we can go back and find arguments that people making this point a long time back. Now, what Kalecki did do, though, was to talk about the burden of interest payments, and he also, of course, ran through. Although I don't think he ever set it out algebraically, what happens if the government runs a budget deficit, which I say averages there, and then we can go through and work out whether or not that will be sustainable. And I think a number of points arise here. One is that if we have a continuing primary budget deficit, that's excluding interest payments, then sustainability would require that the rate of interest is less than the growth rate. I think until recently, people would have said that condition doesn't hold. But of course, there is the work of now people like Blanchard in the American Economic Review and elsewhere that argues that the condition for the growth rate being greater than the rate of interest now does hold, so we can get with sustainability. But also we can take it that if we have the second point I want to make is that if we have we look at the overall deficit, then that will and we run on average a deficit, then the outstanding national debt will converge as indicated there. Although whether or not that budget deficit involves a primary surplus or not will vary. But the point, the particular point I want to make, well, 2 points that really related here. One is that from a aggregate demand point of view, it is the overall budget deficit that is relevant. We would assume that the interest payments are treated as income, and at least some of that would be spent. So whether interest payments have the same stimulating effect as other transfers is obviously debatable, but overall, it's the overall budget deficit which is relevant here. But it follows from that if it's the overall budget deficit which is relevant, then we do have to pay some attention to what is the amount of the public debt, and particularly what is the interest payments on that, because clearly after the pandemic, the interest payments on public debt may be actually rather low given the low rates of interest. So, but if we think, well, there's a size of budget deficit which is relevant for achieving full employment, then if the interest payments on the government debt are higher within that overall budget deficit, then the relationship between government spending and taxation will be such that government expenditure relative to taxation will be lower than it would have been otherwise. So if we don't like, as it were, who receives the interest payments on government debt, then we may want to say, well, we want to not pay too much attention to that, and we want to focus on the overall balance between government expenditure on goods and services and the tax revenue. Now, one of the proposals which Kalecki made was, in effect, if you're kind of worried about that, well, let's levy an annual capital tax, and let's meet those interest payments by levying more tax so that we can keep expenditure higher, and we levy the tax to raise money to finance, is a word to finance the interest payments. See, I think Kalecki at one point says, well, let's think about what has been the extra debt incurred during the war, and let us look at the interest payments on those and raise an annual wealth tax to pay for those. He did, though, argue that he thought an annual wealth tax would affect neither capitalist consumption nor the profitability of investment, which I think maybe be a little dubious. But I think the point to note is this idea that obviously for any particular budget deficit, then higher interest payments will reduce government expenditure relative to taxation. And if we're worried about that, then we could levy a tax in this sort of way, although it's not particularly something I would think I'll go along with. Now, in the paper, I go into a bit of, which I think will be the arguments that no doubt will arise after the pandemic about the size of the public debt. Because just in the case of the UK, it's now gone up from about 80% of GDP. I think it's just gone over 100% very recently, and I imagine before the end it will go up to 120% or something like that. And so it, as compared with prior to the financial crisis when it was around about 35, I think 40%, because it really scales into insignificance against the budget deficit at the end of the war, which was 250% of GDP. But one sees at the moment kind of rumblings, particularly amongst the some of the conservative members of Parliament in the UK, to the effect that we must bring down this this deficit. Bring down the debt. I think referring back to the argument I had before, I think this would be fairly catastrophic in the sense that if you try to start running surpluses, particularly in a context of what would no doubt would be relatively low investment and relatively high savings, that's going to be pretty catastrophic in a fairly obvious way. I just point here to also the arguments which I'm sure you'll all be very familiar with, which come from Reinhardt and Rogoff in particular, though there are many others, to the effect that debt levels, national debt levels, maybe above 90% of GDP, lead to sometimes catastrophe, sometimes to marginally lower growth rates. As an aside here, I don't know how it was in other countries, but certainly I think in the UK, one can find many examples of the way in which Reinhardt, or particularly Rogoff's arguments, were very influential on policy. He was said by George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to be his favourite economist, and so he did have quite an effect. I'm sure you'll all be aware of the ways in which the work of Reinhardt and Rogoff have been debunked by many of our fellow travellers. Those at Herden and Ash and Polin at Amherst, and then another recent paper which has just come out, or is in the online availability of the Cambridge Journal. So I just put that in, and it doesn't particularly relate to, I think, Kalecki, but just to indicate that in terms of the arguments, which no doubt will come to the fore after the pandemic, that really we don't need to be concerned, in effect, about the scale of the debt after the pandemic ended. What we should be worried about is people wanting to push for a budget surplus in order to reduce it, and that really would be the way of damaging the economy. Now, the last set of remarks I want to make, and again, these are maybe relatively familiar to you, and I just want to at least take some of the points that Kalecki made in his famous 1943 political quarterly paper about reaching full employment and the arguments which would be against it. I do always think that when he wrote, as I quote here, a solid majority of economists is now of the opinion that in a capitalist economy, full employment can be secured by a government spending program. I wonder how large that majority was. But it also indicated, provided there exists in existence adequate plan to employ all existing labour power and provide adequate supplies of necessary foreign raw materials. So again, balance of payments limitations and capacity limitations. I think he also, in his paper on 3 ways to full employment, compared the use of the budget deficit with the redistribution of income and also the stimulating of investment. And I think he argued there that there were at least clear limits to how far investment could be stimulated and without affecting or leading into situations of more excess capacity as that investment added to the capital stock, the effect it might have on the rate of profit and so forth. But also he, and I have always had this feeling that really his preferred solution would have been the redistribution of income. But in a paper I wrote a few years ago on I think I called a progressive way to reduce the budget deficits, which was to follow up on this idea of the redistribution of income. If you start doing back of envelope calculations, you don't really get very far, unfortunately. So even if it's a wage-led or whatever economy, you still don't get a great deal of mileage out of that. So having a budget deficit of 1 or 2% more is likely to have more effect than quite a major shift in the distribution of income insofar as demand is concerned. So as we well know, and we can find plenty of examples of this, Kalecki warned that those who opposed the idea that full employment can be achieved by government spending, there were and are prominent so-called economic experts closely connected with banking and industry, just as a political background to the opposition to full employment. And I think we could readily find many, particularly around about 2010, 2011, in the UK at least, many experts, and particularly journalists, and as well as other representatives, saying that governments couldn't spend or couldn't or shouldn't spend any more, and that austerity was needed and fiscal consolidation was required. And I think one other aspect which I think Kalecki pointed to, and this is the hold, as it were, which the doctrine of sound finance can have, which is to make the level of employment dependent upon the state of confidence. And I just pick out one quote here that from, again, George Osborne. I think he made this actually just before he came into government, rather than when he was in government, but a credible fiscal consolidation problem will have a positive impact through greater certainty and confidence about the future. So very much playing up that the confidence would be aided by actually reducing the budget deficit, by bringing down the debt and so forth, and that it was confidence on that in those lines. And so obviously an argument we often hear, but what we, and it is well known, what is the purpose of this sort of argument, which is to make the doctrines of sound finance plausible, as it were, because they're appealing to the need to maintain the confidence of finance and bankers, so they will invest and lend and so forth. I think, as is will be well known, Kalecki could see that there was a number of social and political obstacles to the achievement of prolonged full employment, arguing that the social position of the boss would be undermined, self-assurance would grow, strikes for wage increases and improvements in work conditions would create political tensions. I think, although I haven't gone very far in this, I think one could look very much at the developments in labour markets over the last 30, 40 years, and the extent to which, through a variety of changes in the labour force, in the operations of the labour market, it's reduced where the ability for strikes for wage increases and improvement in working conditions and so forth, so that and I think numbers have argued that inflation is lower because of changes in the labour market, which has reduced the bargaining power of workers. And I think that fits in very much with this sort of line of argument of Kalecki. So it is again, I think, well known, he saw laissez-faire capitalism as inconsistent with sustained full employment. would require the development of these social and political institutions. And then we come back to the article by the posthumously published Kalecki and Kalecki, looking at whether there had been these crucial reforms, or a crucial reform which had enabled the capitalist economy to sustain full employment and in this way, and what sort of transformations had been undertaken, and whether the fundamental reforms that he had pointed to be needing had in some sense taken place, or at least whether it was sufficient of them to be able to maintain full employment. I think in some respects, the timing of this was not of the best, in the sense that as I think John King has pointed out, by the crucial reforms, which had already begun to unravel. I think if one looked at it again in the case of the UK, one would be saying sometime beginning really in the mid 1960s, although that's when it only came to full fruition in the late 70s, early 1980s. And so King points to the crucial reforms which were, in his view, beginning to unravel in this way. But as I think he points out, the unraveling of these crucial reforms was the ushering in of the eras of neoliberalism, globalization and financialization, which had been, as we know, accompanied by rising inequality and also generally slower economic growth. I think some would claim, though, that unemployment has, particularly one Donald Trump would no doubt have claimed that unemployment had disappeared under his miracle. And in the UK, unemployment as registered unemployment, measured ILO measure of unemployment, I think is around about, well, it's just gone up now to 4.2%. So in one sense, one could say there's been sort of quasi-full employment, not on the scale that we had in the 1950s and 1960s, but significantly lower than we had in the early 2010s. However, I think that that is really kind of misleading, in the sense of we know, or this is in terms of take the labor, what's sometimes called labor market slack, or then under the various extended measures of unemployment, these are very much considerably higher. The US, as it were, the so-called U6 measure of unemployment averaged 14.6% in the first half of the 2010s and 8.7% in the second half. And the labour market slack, which is as measured in the EU countries, averaged just under 17% during the 2010s. So there's an S missing there. So I think one could argue that in a variety of ways we have not really experienced what might be called full employment, or at least and in many respects. So the old issues still return. That is, how do we achieve full employment, and in a way which is compatible with decent working conditions, and that is still the one of the major tasks which confront us. Okay, let me just summarize what I really wanted to make. There's 4 main points. Kalecki recognized that public expenditure is financed by central bank money creation and private investment by bank loans. He argued that budget deficits to secure full employment would need to be pursued and can always be funded. So budget deficits can not only be initially financed, but also can be funded. So it could be a balanced structural budget would not be attainable, so it's not missing there. Then he supplied a straightforward dismissal of the argument that government debt is a burden on future generations, that a budget deficit to underpin full employment could be funded and sustainable, and that various of his arguments in terms of the issues to do with the achievement of full employment, and the arguments that the way in which fiscal expansion would be undermined by economic experts, and the stress on confidence and those sort of issues have at least bubbled under, if not come to the full surface. But the experiences of the recent decades have highlighted that there have not been the fundamental reforms required to provide sustained non-inflationary full employment, but rather that insofar as there were some reforms, those have now been fully thrown into reverse, and we are back where we started, as it were, or maybe even in a worse position than at the end of the war. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Very interesting. And we have a couple of hands already up. Just to remind, please feel free to type your questions in the chat room or raise hands. Well, I got a special request. So Louis-Philippe, it sounds like you had a question.
I do. Thank you, Alec, and thank you, Malcolm, for your presentations. I just want to, go back to something you said at the very beginning, where you said that Kalecki could be interpreted as a structuralist as opposed to a horizontalist. I wonder what you mean by that. Did you refer to the possibility that banks may raise interest rates or may not fund investment projects? Is that how you define how he would fit into this structuralist position? Because if it is, then I have another comment to follow.
That was essentially the.
So if that's the case, Wolfson in his 1996 paper in the JPKE addressed that issue, and so has Marc Lavoie and myself, that horizontalism is perfectly compatible with credit constraints. I think Wolfson calls it the effective demand for credit. I think that's but I call it the credit worthiness demand for credit. So I still see that as a horizontalist argument.
Well, after what I was saying, that I think Kalecki assumed most of the time they would supply the loans, but they could. But he did have the working assumption, I suppose you could then fit into a much more horizontalist view that much of the time they would supply them, but they had, as it were, reserved the right not to do so.
But that would still be, I don't want to get into that debate, but that would still be a horizontalist position. I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gracian, you're going to be next.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. I think it's really interesting topic. So I have like two questions. First one, can we say that the government spending comes first and then only after that goes taxation and bond issuance? So in other words, whether this critical climb of MMT is valid, or can it be even empirically verified, in your opinion? And the second question is concerning the relevance of Kalecki's profit equation, also from the point of view of the supporters of higher deficit spending. What is your opinion on that? I would be really interested. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. From reading Kalecki, although maybe parts I've overlooked, but I think he was just making the point that that the central bank could and maybe should finance government expenditure. So it's where, in terms of answering the question, where does the money come from? This was his answer. In terms of this relationship between, now I'm going to my own views rather than Kalecki, but in terms of the relationship between government expenditure and taxation, I think they overplay that in the sense of, whilst it is clearly the case that you can't pay taxes in money unless that money has already been issued,
Yes.
But that money might have been issued 200 years ago. So if I ask the question, if the government raised tax rates today, would there be more tax revenue tomorrow without any change in government expenditure? I think the answer would be yes. If I ask the question, will tax revenues increase tomorrow if there's an increase in economic activity, then the answer is yes. So taxes can rise without expenditure rising in that sense. And for the other aspect of this, which I think gets overlooked, is this notion about what I call the funding of government expenditure. It seems to me it's still the case that government expenditure minus tax revenues will equal government borrowing. And so in that sense, government expenditure is going to be funded by a combination of tax revenues and borrowing, whether that's through bonds or through effectively the issue of money. And whether in a kind of time sense, the tax is preceded government expenditure or the government expenditure preceded the tax, I don't think is very relevant. I mean, in some sense, the money's got to be available for the government to make the expenditure. But at the end of the day, the end of the year, when you do the accounts, it will still be the case that the government expenditure would equal tax revenue plus borrowing. No way around that. But there was so the profits equation. Well, I think the only point I was wanting to make here is that Kalecki did nearly always mention that as that would be one result of an increase in government expenditure back in the 1930s, and that I think would clearly come through from a sort of neo-Kalecki type of model. Whether that's whether that's empirically the case is where I don't know, but I think there is that obvious relationship that if there's a budget deficit, then that implies private savings, and if private savings are to be higher, well, then one part of that will be profits being higher.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have quite a few questions, so in the order that I'm seeing them coming up, Amitava, you will be next, Robert, followed by Ilhan, Jerry, Sam. So Dr. Dutt, please.
Hi, Malcolm.
Hi.
Thank you very much for a very nice presentation of Kalecki's ideas on fiscal policy. I had two questions. The first is, why did you not discuss the political obstacles to full employment at all? I mean, that seems to be the major issue. And I've recently reread that paper, and it's still very relevant. I mean, it's a wonderful little paper, but perhaps it needs some updating as well. I think the importance of knowledge power, okay, by which people who are not the captains of industry have influenced the whole discourse on debt, meaning you're taking food away from your babies and and spending it now. So I'd like your comment on that. Well, paper can only cover so much, but I think that that was a big omission. A second point I would like to raise is, what other obstacles there are to increasing employment aside from political ones. And one could be, as you said, inflationary, inflation, but that seems to be belied by the fact that prices have been pretty stable in most countries, despite huge spending increases, before, but also due to it recently with the COVID spending and so forth, and also about the debt question. If it's monetized and not increase in debt, why should it have any the same effect? I think you first said it doesn't, but then recently in answering Grashan's, I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name, I'm sure. Hi there, how are you doing?
It was almost perfect.
Okay. That even though it is an increase in debt, it's to the central bank, and that has very different implications than public debt, for instance. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. I just say we're I think in reverse order. I think if we're looking at the present situation, or at least over the last 6 months, at least in the UK, and I imagine it's quite similar elsewhere, we've had a rather kind of peculiar sort of situation, because on the one side, we've had, broadly speaking, attempts to maintain the level of demand. In the case of by furloughing, making payments for workers to be furloughed, some relatively minor rises in social welfare payments, various effectively delaying tax payments to maintain demand. And I think in kind of normal circumstances, that might have been very inflationary, because if you've got a reduction in supply, which we had in the UK, I think is where a reduction of 20% in supply and demand is maintained, you'd expect that to be inflationary. But again, what happened in the UK was that, first of all, that demand couldn't be exercised. We couldn't go shopping because the restaurants were shut, or the bars were shut, and for a long time, various clothes shops and all sorts of things were shut. So we couldn't exercise that demand. And also, maybe for reasons of there were uncertainty and so on, the savings ratio has kind of shot through the roof. It's gone up quite largely. So I think that's kind of part of the explanation, that this is like unusual circumstances currently, that at the same time that supply is being reduced, demand in the sense of holding of money or whatever has been maintained, but be able to exercise that demand has been much reduced. I think on the other side, in terms of the quantitative easing and monetizing, and the extent to which there's been monetizing of the deficit, I think I don't know how much weight to put on this, but one of the changes which has taken place, 15 years ago, is that the money issued by the central bank, that is the reserves held by the commercial banks, are paid interest, so that the interest payments on the debt is paid whether or not that is bonds or whether it is done through the monetization in terms of holding reserves. But then also the counterpart to those commercial bank reserves have often been holding in savings accounts rather than in check or current account. So that one would, I think, have to look at the portfolio composition of the debt and the way that debt is held and so forth. And I think I suppose the experience from the after the financial crisis was clear that quantitative easing didn't lead to inflation because of the way it took place, which was just that exchange of one set of financial assets for another set of financial assets, which doesn't really yield inflation. So I think perhaps more, I don't know whether this is also part of your argument, clearly on the whole, we've experienced inflation, low inflation over the last, 15 years or so, even during times when unemployment, well, going up and coming down. I think I partly there look at what are the conditions in the labour market, to what extent the unemployment figures really reflects the degree of market slack, the extent to which people are on things like 0 hours contracts, the rise of the precariat and so forth, and all those features which reduce the inflationary pressures. I don't know whether that kind of fully answers your question, but that's my stab at it. In terms of the political obstacles, I mean, I agree. I didn't. That was squeezed out through Louis-Philippe limiting me to 8,000 words. Yeah, but I think that is something to be extended in terms of kind of updating those arguments for the way in which those political obstacles now reflect themselves in public discourse and so forth.
Robert, if that's okay, Sam has to run to teach and asked to. Are you on mute, Robert? But I understand you're agreeing with it. Sam, if you're online, could you unmute and ask your question?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yep.
So my question is regarding the interest payments on the debt. So Kalecki's point about the capital levy is well taken, and Keynes made a similar argument. But if we're talking about the government, and I would count myself in the MMT camp, so I'm looking at the concept of monetary sovereignty here. The government is clearly, it's not a necessity for it to pay interest on its liabilities. It's clearly a policy choice. Obviously, it can issue liabilities where it doesn't pay interest, and it'll still be able to float those and still make the payments it needs to make. And so I think one question is, as an alternative to a capital levy or something like that, we should be asking, should the government be making interest payments at all? I mean, at least we can look at the extent to which there might be trade-offs of those different approaches to the interest payment question if interest payments were becoming a problem. For instance, if there's something useful that interest payments are doing, maybe it's subsidizing banks or providing income to retirees, maybe there's other ways to accomplish those policy goals, and instead we should not be paying interest on the government's liabilities at all. So I'm wondering what your take on that is, and if Kalecki addressed that possibility at all. Thank you.
As far as I know, he didn't. Kalecki didn't kind of address that. I was thinking I should, declare an interest, since probably a significant part of my income is dependent upon government bonds. Since I do have a funded pension scheme, and do also have some monies in what in the UK is called National Savings and Investment, which is the arm which borrows directly from the public for the government. I think I'd definitely point out that the money, which, at least, and you could say that they don't have to do this, but the money which is issued by the central bank does bear interest. That is, the reserve. With that now comes as reserves, which are held by the commercial banks with the central bank, and the central bank does pay interest on that, and the interest it's paying is at a level that's going to be comparable to the interest rate on bonds. So they are paying interest through that route. Now you could say, well, they don't have to do that, and in the past they haven't done that. Now whether what the effects of having a what in the UK case would be 100% or debt of 100% of GDP, which doesn't yield any interest, and what are the extent to which individuals will be prepared to hold that as their savings, which is what they're having to do. I suspect that seems to me always the difficulty, that why would anybody accept government debt if it's not going to yield them any interest? It's the old question of why would anybody ever hold money if money is yielding a zero rate of interest? So it has implications, I think, for the way in which the holding of savings would take place, and what the effects would be as everybody, as it were, rushes out not to hold government debt, but to hold some assets which might yield a rate of interest.
Thank you. Robert, please remember to unmute.
Yes, are you all hearing me?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, thank you for going to Sam first. And actually, my question is very related to that, a little bit broader take on the same question, which is, Malcolm, and hello, and thank you for the presentation. How would you compare Kalecki's view of fiscal policy and budget deficits with the MMT view more broadly? It's gained a lot of prominence in recent years. On the other hand, there's large parts of it that seem to be basic post-Keynesian and Kaleckian reasoning, and some parts that maybe go beyond that. And particularly, there's an emphasis in MMT, as I understand it, and my understanding is limited, but on whether a country has what you might call monetary autonomy. That is, that the government is a currency issuer, and it's a strong currency with a floating exchange rate. So, like, Canada, U.S., and U.K. qualify, but individual European countries on the euro don't. And then there's this whole debate about whether it applies to developing countries, and that's another question you're going to get soon coming up from the chat. But more broadly, how would you compare Kalecki's approach to MMT? What have they added, and what have they forgotten, and who's right if they're different?
I just want to remind everyone we have about 20 minutes left.
It could take 3 hours to answer this question.
That's why I remind.
More than 8,000 words.
I didn't maybe put it quite in these terms. The paper I had in the Real World Economic Review, which on MMT, was in a sense saying, I don't know if I quite phrase like this, that what they say that is right has already been said, in brackets, by Kalecki, and that which is new is not right. Maybe that's exaggerating it, but I would say, in terms of in one sense, when it comes down to it, in a way, I think, and I think this is particularly in the work of Stephanie Kelton, that the limit on the budget deficit in Kalecki is the same as the limit on budget deficits there. That is, you push, as it were, the budget deficit up to the point of full employment. And you can't go beyond that, and you want to fill the gap between, as it were, savings and investment, as I've indicated. So the limit on the budget deficit is the limit of at full employment. So and you can't go beyond that. Now, I don't know, feeling from the MMT is that it's there, but it's not often very much emphasized. So, but if you, in the work of, I think, Stephanie, there was a note I think she wrote a few years ago, which very much, kind of sets this out, and I think that's the same sort of limit. I think the other, I'm not quite sure if this is quite fair, but I think also Kalecki, although most of his emphasis was on using the budget deficit on that, but I think he always made the point that the expenditure had to be useful. And that no doubt was part of his dislike of the armaments economy, that was expenditure which was stimulating the economy, but not very useful. So I think he always would stress that the expenditure was had to be socially useful, or in line with the social objectives of government, he would put it. And I think quite often you always get the impression from MMT that any expenditure will do, although no, it's quite often linked with kind of good causes, but whether it be green investment or whatever. In terms of the monetary, the sovereignty, I don't know that Kalecki ever approached that. What I think he did do was to stress the constraints of the balance of payments. And I think particularly writing in the 1930s, he saw as where the outflow of gold from a country would be a significant limitation. So it would be a different sort of constraint on the ability. I suppose at the time he was writing, would be that most of the borrowing would be internal, at least in the countries that he was looking at, and it comes from the borrowing abroad. But I think there was that kind of constraint from the balance of payments, but maybe take a rather different form to the way that MMT portray it.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we could take questions from a couple of people. That has this been done before, virtually. So Ilhan, go ahead and ask your question. Then maybe Jerry, I will follow up with.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think nowadays the new notion or term fiscal sustainability used by some mainstream scholars to replace this budget, balanced budget, because they have experience they trying to keep deficit low, they end up with the higher deficit because there will be lower income in the market to be taxed. But as you mentioned, the ability or the sustainability depends on the higher growth rate over the interest rate. I think it depends also on the income composition, tax income composition of the government. Not only, as you said, expenditure has to be useful, yes, there has to be income and employment generating, but on the other hand, for example, Turkey has a 60% of tax income composed of indirect taxes, which is a burden on lower income and middle class who has a higher propensity to consume and being employed. That's why this public deficit discussion, we focus mostly on expenditure side, but also the income, tax income composition is also important. If the government expends so much, okay, but on the other collects tax from these poor guys, then at the end it will not be effective, I think. Thank you so much.
Should we take one more?
Yeah.
Jerry, please go ahead.
All right. Hi, Malcolm. How are you? Malcolm, thank you for your presentation. My question is on Kalecki's idea of full employment. What have you got an idea about what he thought about what it is in terms of the quality of full employment? Because in Australia, and I'm sure in a lot of countries, they count somebody as employed if they've worked for 1 hour, and therefore they pat themselves on the back and they've got all this employment when a lot of so-called employment is very much underemployed, and a lot of the employment is also precarious employment. And in Kalecki's time, I'm not sure, but I think, did he have a one-size-fits-all view of what employment is and what full employment actually means? Because in this day and age, governments have manipulated the term employment for their own political uses. And just a quick comment, public expenditure, you only know if it's useful only after it's happened, only in hindsight. You know, a lot of things like computers came out of militarism and a lot of other things. And I agree, militarism isn't useful, but in hindsight, some of it is. So I don't know how you can work out what is useful, given that you only know in hindsight whether some public expenditure is useful or not.
Very some challenging question.
Yeah. Well, I feel I should have said intended to be useful or perceived to be useful ahead of time. Or I think Kalecki used some phrase about meeting social objectives or the objectives of government. So I think it's perceived benefits rather than after the event. And of course, obviously people will differ what they mean by useful. I think the point you on full employment or the way it's measured, I think in a way you probably in effect answered the question. That is, as far as I can tell, and writing in what 1930s, full employment presumably meant the full-time employment of males between 14 and 65 or 70, and single women probably. At least I don't know elsewhere. I think in this country we had something called a marriage bar in many occupations, that a woman who got married in, I think, in the public service, in teaching and the post office and elsewhere, had to retire when she got married. So it would have been very much in terms of that type of workforce. And I think I agree with your point that, and I think this is actually one of the difficulties now of defining what we mean by full employment and how would we achieve it. It's one thing if you've got, effectively want to get all males employed full-time, as it were, by stimulating demand. But if you want to get full employment as we might now understand it in terms of, then does that need much more targeting? You know, if you have a general increase in demand, will that necessarily lead to people who are on 0 hours contracts having more secure employment, or will it raise the hours of work? And I think that's, I haven't done very much about this, but I try to think in terms of what that would mean. And I think that is so I think it's probably an argument for saying that fiscal policy would have to be, as always before perhaps, go alongside a variety of other measures if we're going to have full employment, or even get anywhere close to it. Because the sort of figures I put up at the end would suggest we're often now 10, 15% off, as it were, or even before the pandemic. Oh, the first one about fiscal sustainability. Well, I think if you're calculating, I don't know if I quite get the point, but if you're calculating fiscal sustainability, then you have to take into account with the structure of tax and structure of expenditure and what effects that has upon on demand and elsewhere. But I would take it that in general, a total budget deficit will be sustainable because it will eventually converge, the debt ratio will eventually converge to the deficit divided by the nominal growth rate, and that will be sustainable. One can think of cases where it might not be because of later on an unwillingness of bondholders to roll over the debt, and those sort of issues might well arise. But provided the deficit is run to meet the difference between, to try to meet the difference between savings and investment, then I suppose, as Kalecki argued, that will be always can be funded. And if people are willing to hold the deficit as savings, as it were, then are they willing to hold the corresponding bonds and stock of debt as part of their wealth?
Okay. We have a lively discussion in the chat room, by the way.
Yeah,
yeah.
I can't multitask, unfortunately.
There's a question from Dawa Sherpa.
Uh-huh.
Dawa online, would you like to ask a question? The question reads the following: notwithstanding, and it relates to what the comment that Robert made just a few minutes ago, notwithstanding the validity of argument of maintaining full employment by running high budget deficit and closed economy, but will it be possible for open, emerging, and developing countries receiving large international capital flows to maintain expansionary fiscal policy, given global financial investors' resistance against any increase in budget deficit and consequent threat of reversals of capital flows? So it kind of connects back to in my mind, for some reason, with the MMT argument and so on, but in a developing country context.
This isn't going to be a very good answer, but I think it seems to be there that limitation is not on as it were, the fiscal deficit per se. The limit is on the ability to borrow from abroad and whether that borrowing is going to take place for public or for private reasons. And I can see that is likely to be a very large constraint, but for that not to be addressed, as it were, by the budget deficit, but try to be addressed by what is it that requires this borrowing from abroad, and that's so. I think as I say, I think I see the constraint is coming from the overall borrowing from overseas, and also borrowing in another currency, maybe. But and so that's where the limitations are, and so that should be the focus. And within that, you have to. So yes, the achievement of full employment is going to be limited by many other factors as well in terms of lack of capacity.
And I think it's becoming even more of a hotly debated topic these days. There's an update or follow-up by Amitav Dutt on the same question, I think, related to the same topic. Why does the government have to pay interest to the central bank? I can understand your point about the public. And someone just mentioned balance of payments, which seems to be a major constraint, which you just mentioned, but not the US. So if we think in the context of US, UK, the question, why does the government have to pay interest to the central bank?
No, the central bank is holding some of the bonds of government. So in that sense, the government is paying interest to the central bank because of the holding of bonds. It's paying the interest on bonds. But the counterpart to that will be that the central bank will be receiving interest on the bonds, but in turn will be paying interest on the reserves which are held by the commercial bank. So we might be making a small kind of profit out of it, but then that profit goes back to the government anyway, because the central bank is publicly owned, and insofar as its profits in the end belong to the government.
Well, I don't think we have any other questions. In words of Professor Stiansky yesterday, Kalecki would make one statement and it would mean everything as a book. And I'm reminded, so first of all, thank you very much for your presentation, but in the context of being laconic, I remember what I used as Kalecki's quote in my book, and it's totally related to this. He said, an increase in the number of paupers does not broaden the market. And I'll leave the audience to ponder on that. I use that in talking about, the 1990s great reforms that we went through in Eastern Europe. So thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Thank everyone. And this concludes this session.